They were still breathing when the deacon found them, though the room smelled of a slaughter yard in August, and the frost on the inside of the windows had not lifted for 3 weeks. The smaller girl, Mercy, sat upright at the deal table, with her palms pressed flat to the boards as though she might push straight through the grain and disappear into the earth. Her eyes were open, the pupils blown wide, and the whites had gone the color of old parchment left too near a lamp. Her sister, Deliverance, lay across the bench with her spine arched so violently that the back of her skull touched her heels, a hoop of bone and skin no wider than a cider barrel, and the sound that came from her throat was not a sigh, but the slow leak of wind through a crack in a coffin lid. Both children's mouths were stained a bruised purple, as if they had been sucking elderberries or communion wine, yet the only vessel on the table was a tin cup filled with what looked like clear well water, and when the deacon lifted it, the surface shivered like something alive and trying to climb out. He told the minister later that he had not meant to drink, only to smell, but the steam, or whatever rose from that cup, tasted of iron and salt and the cold underside of stones in a river, and it stayed on his tongue for 7 years, through 2 wars and a fever that took his wife, until the morning he woke unable to recall any prayer except the girls' names. By then the house had been pulled down, the beams burned where they stood, and the stones of the cellar rolled into the Sheepscot River. Yet men swore the ground refused to accept seed for a generation. Wheat sprouted white, corn grew without kernels, and the hay smelled of carrion when it burned. The last man who tried to plow the acreage turned back at midfield when his team began to tremble and sweat, though the day was sharp with February ice. He said the furrow opened like a mouth, and he heard a child's voice from beneath the blade reciting the 119th Psalm backward, omitting every mention of bread. That was in 1736, 8 years after the fast began, and no minister, magistrate, or physician has ever explained why the children refused food, why their parents permitted it, or why the younger girl's hair continued to grow, soft, fair, waist-length, though her body dwindled to the weight of a hair. Everything else, testimony, diary, sermon, or letter, ends in mid-sentence, as though the writers laid down their quills and walked quietly into the tide. Tonight, by lamplight, I read the fragment aloud to an empty room, and the wick shortened with each syllable until the flame guttered blue. Somewhere in the wall, a mouse gnawed once, then ceased, and the house seemed to lean inward, listening. If you leave now, you may still outdistance the story, but if you stay, you will hear what the river, the cellar, and the slow starvation of 2 innocents have kept secret for 200 years and 98 days. The interval, I have calculated, between the first refusal of bread and the last heartbeat recorded in any archive. Remember this. In 1728, the province of Maine was not yet 30 years separated from Massachusetts, its forests full of wolves and itinerant preacher-men, its coast littered with the ribs of French privateers, and its god a Calvinist surgeon who amputated without narcotic. Children died so commonly that their names were reused before the graves had settled. Yet these 2, Mercy aged 9, Deliverance aged 11, were spoken of in meeting houses as though they had been seen walking on the sea at dusk, their feet not wet, their mouths sealed by an oath older than any Bible carried across the Atlantic. The image that will not leave me is this: a room without fire, 2 girls growing lighter while the winter grows heavier, and somewhere beneath the floorboards, a scrap of paper repeating the same sentence until the paper itself becomes a tongue. Obadiah Stroud bought the plot at the head of the tide in 1721, paying with 3 barrels of lime and a cooper's iron stolen from a wrecked sloop out of Portsmouth. The land was second-growth pine and alder, so recently scraped by glacier that the stones still bore parallel scars like the teeth of a giant saw. He built a house in the manner of the West Country, oak beams pinned with trenails, chimney of field stone laid in clay, and a single chamber above the workshop where the smell of fresh-cut staves rose through the floor like the breath of something caged. His wife, Silence, came from the Kennebec patent. Her dowry a treadle lathe and a library consisting of Baxter's Saints' Everlasting Rest, and an almanac annotated by a hand that predicted eclipses but never gave a name. They kept the Sabbath with such rigor that the hearth was swept cold from Saturday dusk to Monday dawn, and in that interval no candle was lit, no food warmed, no shoe latched, so that the children learned to taste darkness as other children tasted maple. Mercy was born in the 2nd year of the house, her call folded into the family Bible like a bookmark. Deliverance followed 23 months later, so pale at birth that the midwife wrapped her in the skin of a freshly killed deer, claiming the warmth of the beast might coax the soul to stay. The girls grew on barley broth and scripture, their limbs long and thin as the alder saplings they wove into hoops for their father's barrels. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in the cadence of the 1611 Psalms, as though they had been memorized in utero. In summer they were sent to gather sphagnum for insulation, and they returned with their skirts full of the moss still holding the chill of the bog. In winter they scraped salt from the rocks at the river's mouth, their fingers cracking so regularly that the blood formed a second skin, darker than the first. Obadiah prospered enough to acquire 2 indentured men, one a lame Welshman who sang in a language no one understood, the other a boy of 14 whose left ear had been cropped for theft in Boston, and together they produced pipe staves for the Caribbean trade, each board curved like a rib, smelling of pine and tar and the faint sweetness of rot. Silence kept the accounts in a ledger bound with sealskin, her entries so economical that a year's commerce could be read in the time it took the kettle to boil. She never crossed out a figure, only drew a faint line beneath an error, as though even mistakes must be preserved for judgment. The family ate once a day, at dusk, a stew of beans and salt pork thickened with meal, and after the blessing Obadiah would read a chapter, always selecting the minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, his voice descending into a growl when he reached the verses about famine of hearing. By 1727, the girls had reached the age when girls elsewhere began to think of ribbons, but theirs was a household that regarded adornment as the first stain of Babylon. Their only mirror was the rain barrel, and they studied their reflections with the detachment of naturalists examining a specimen already pinned. It was in that year that the coast experienced a drought so complete that the Sheepscot withdrew from its banks, exposing the ribs of a vessel older than any English chart, its timbers blackened but still smelling of the resin that had once sealed them. Obadiah brought home a splinter and set it on the mantel, claiming it was a sign that the sea would give up its dead before the land did. The splinter remained there through the winter, and sometimes at night the resin warmed and the room filled with an odor like tears and evergreen. Mercy complained that the smell made her think of food she had never tasted. Bread soft enough to leave the imprint of a finger, apples heated in cider until they burst. Deliverance said nothing, but she began to disappear for hours, returning with her feet wet, though no snow had melted, her lips moving silently, as though she conversed with someone whose name must not be spoken aloud. In March of 1728, the lame Welshman vanished. His hammock was found slit along the seam, and in the sawdust beneath the workshop floor, searchers discovered a pewter spoon melted into the shape of a tongue, still warm to the touch, though the night had been sharp with frost. Obadiah told the constable that the man had walked into the forest in search of a sound only he could hear, and because indentures were bought and sold like barrels, no further inquiry was made. But silence closed the ledger on that day and never opened it again, as though the account of the world had balanced at last, and nothing further need be recorded. The land had memory before the Strouds arrived, though no parchment remembered it. The Abenaki called the river the place where stones weep, and they burned their dead on platforms so the smoke could carry grief away before it settled into the soil. Closer in time, a sawyer named Jabez Kane felled a pine in 1719 and discovered within the trunk a chain of human teeth, each root intact, threaded on deer sinew. He carried the necklace to the meeting house, where the elders voted to rebury it in unconsecrated ground. But that night the sexton dreamed of a mouth opening in the earth and woke with soil under his fingernails. The Stroud house stood on a rise that had once been an island at high tide. When the moon pulled the sea far enough inland, salt water lapped the cellar stones, leaving a white rim like the crust on a week-old wound. Local midwives told of infants born with the taste of brine on their tongues, whose first cry sounded like the gull's, and who refused the breast until they had been swaddled in linen soaked in seawater. Most died before teething, and their mothers buried them face down so they would not see the path back. In 1720, a traveling minister named Palfrey held a 3-day fast on the marsh, preaching from a tree stump half submerged in tannin-dark water. On the final night he vanished, leaving behind a Bible whose pages had been sliced out to form a hollow large enough to cradle a child's skull, and the cavity was lined with goose down still pulsing, as though the feathers retained the warmth of the body that had pressed them. The Strouds attended no revival. They preferred the austerity of the Sabbath to the ecstasy of the camp meeting, yet Obadiah once confessed to a customer that he had seen lights moving across the marsh on the eve of the spring equinox, not the yellow of lanterns, but a blue so pale it seemed the moon had bled into the fog. Silence kept a separate almanac in which she recorded not weather, but the migrations of sorrow. The day the neighbor's boy was found drowned in a hoof print filled with rain, the week the crows flew backward, the hour the church bell rang though the rope lay coiled on the pulpit floor. She wrote these things in a cipher borrowed from the Apostle Paul, Greek letters transliterated into Roman, read right to left, and when Mercy discovered the journal, she asked her mother why the word for hunger looked so like the word for kingdom. Silence replied that in heaven the two are one, and closed the book. Deliverance, the elder, had begun to menstruate in the autumn of 1727. The blood appeared black in the dim loft, and she collected it in a rag, which she buried beneath the pine that leaned toward the sea, believing that the tree would carry the secret to the waves and drown it. Instead, the tree bled resin the color of clotted cream, and the spot became warm to the touch even in January. Obadiah cut the sapling for barrel hoops, but the wood warped overnight into a spiral that no iron could straighten, and the barrels made from it would not hold water, only sound. When tilted, they echoed with the slow lap of tide. By the turn of the year, the family had begun to dream the same dream, a table set with every vessel empty, yet so heavy with absence that the boards bowed. Around it sat children without faces, their mouths open onto darkness that smelled of apples left to ferment in a tomb. Obadiah consulted the minister, who advised prayer and a diet of barley water thickened with molasses. The girls refused both, claiming the sweetness tasted of sin, and instead began to chew on the raw pine of their bed frame, spitting splinters as thin as quills. In April, the cropped boy who worked the cooperage tried to run away. He was caught at the marsh edge, his pockets full of acorn flour, and when questioned, he said he had meant to bake cakes for the sisters so they would not fade. Obadiah whipped him with a stave until the boy's back resembled a map of rivers, then locked him in the drying shed where the barrels sang their title song all night. In the morning the boy was gone, the door still barred from within. Only the acorn flower remained, scattered in the shape of two small footprints side by side, the toes pointing upward as though the earth had taken him in a dance. Mercy complained at dawn that her stomach was already full, not of food but of a presence that pressed against her ribs like the knuckles of an unseen hand. She would not say whether the hand offered or withheld. Deliverance, who had spoken barely a dozen words since the equinox, led her sister to the pine stump where the minister's Bible had been found. There they sat cross-legged, facing each other, breathing in unison until their exhalations clouded and merged and could no longer be told apart. At midday, Obadiah brought the daily pot of beans, but the girls turned their faces to the wall. Mercy whispered that the steam carried the voice of the cropped boy reciting the catechism backward, and she would not swallow a syllable of idolatry. Silence tried coaxing with a spoonful of molasses, but Deliverance knocked the pewter from her hand. The spoon struck the floor and rang like a bell, a sound that lingered long enough to summon the crows from the marsh, who settled on the sill and watched without blinking. That night the parents sat at the foot of the ladder leading to the loft, listening to the slow synchrony of their daughter's breath, a rhythm so precise it seemed the room itself was inhaling and exhaling, growing larger and smaller like a lung, testing the dimensions of its cage. Obadiah recited the 34th Psalm. "They that seek the Lord shall not want any good thing," but the words tasted of sawdust, and he found himself omitting every verse that mentioned taste or satisfaction until the scripture lay in shards around his feet. Silence carried the bucket herself, wading through mud that sucked at her ankles like a congregation hungry for testimony. When she returned, the water had already clouded, though no sediment stirred, and the surface bore a skin that dimpled when she spoke. The girls drank a sip each, eyes closed, throats moving like the gullets of nestlings, then pushed the cup away, claiming satiety. Mercy said the liquid had expanded inside her until her body was a vessel larger than the house, and she feared that if she took more, she would spill over the world. On the third day, Obadiah walked to the meeting house and asked the elders to pray the demon of refusal out. They came in a phalanx of black coats, their boots leaving rectangles of frost on the pine floor, and knelt in a circle around the children, who sat unmoved, pupils dilated as if they had already entered the darkness the men feared. The minister tried to lay a hand on Mercy's forehead, but the skin beneath his palm grew cold enough to numb his fingers, and when he withdrew, he found the print of her pulse branded into his flesh, a violet oval that would not fade until his death in the smallpox epidemic 6 winters later. That night, the cooperage caught fire, though no flame had been kindled. The barrels stood in ranks like worshippers and ignited from within, sending up a plume of resinous smoke that smelled of incense and burnt hair, and when the roof collapsed, the sparks spelled 2 words against the sky: "Fast and enter," before the wind carried them off. Obadiah dragged the girls from the loft, their bodies so light he feared they might already be ash wrapped in skin. They smiled at the conflagration, the first expression he had seen on their faces in weeks, and Deliverance whispered that the fire had tasted what it wanted and would now leave them alone. In the ruins the next morning, Silence found the pewter spoon that had been lost, its bowl twisted into the shape of a tiny cradle. Inside it lay a single drop of water that had not evaporated, and when she tilted it, the drop rolled like mercury, refusing to fall. With the cooperage gone, the family moved into the single chamber of the original house, all 4 sleeping in the bed once shared by the parents alone. The girls lay between Obadiah and Silence like a bar of ice dividing warm earth, and their breath condensed on the underside of the quilts, dripping onto the parents' skin like meltwater from a crypt. Obadiah tried to resume work in a neighbor's shed, but every stave he planed cracked along the grain, and the iron hoops rusted overnight into flakes that stained his palms the color of dried blood. He began to dream of barrels filled not with rum, but with silence, stacked in the hold of a ship that sailed nowhere, drifting on a tide that tasted of tears. Silence took to walking the marsh at dusk, her shoes filling with brackish water that left salt rings on her wool stockings. She claimed she was searching for the crop-eared boy, though she carried no lantern, guided instead by the sound of someone chewing, a slow mastication that ceased whenever she stopped moving. The girls no longer asked for water. They sat at the table with hands folded, staring at the empty trencher as though it might yield if watched long enough, and their knees knocked together in a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the house, a pulse audible in the rafters whenever the wind eased. Mercy's hair, once the color of ripe wheat, began to darken from the roots, each strand appearing to absorb the dimness of the room until it hung like strips of wet ash. Deliverance's nails grew at a visible rate, curving inward until they bit the flesh of her palms, yet she showed no pain, only a quiet satisfaction when the blood welled and pooled in the lifeline like holy water in a font. Neighbors brought gifts, milk, fish, a loaf sweetened with maple, but the girls turned their faces to the wall and the food soured within hours. The milk curdled into the shape of a heart, the fish eyes clouded into the image of a crucifix. The loaf cracked open to reveal a cavity shaped like a child's mouth. One afternoon the Welshman's widow arrived, claiming she had seen her husband in a dream standing knee-deep in the river, his lame leg straight at last, beckoning to her with a spoon carved from birch. She demanded the Strouds return his belongings, but when she entered the house, the air inside was so cold her breath fell to the floor and shattered like glass. She found only Mercy awake, rocking on her heels and humming a tune that had no origin in any psalter. The widow asked where the girl's parents were, and Mercy replied that they had gone to harvest silence and would return when the sheaves were full. The widow fled, but the bruises darkened over the following weeks until they resembled the phases of a lunar eclipse. Eventually the skin sloughed away, revealing beneath it a layer of salt crystals that sparkled like frost, and she took to wearing gloves even in the heat of summer, claiming the salt tasted of sermon and would not dissolve. By midsummer the girls no longer rose from bed. They lay shoulder to shoulder, their bodies describing an S-curve that mirrored the course of the Sheepscot, and the space between them was so cold that condensation formed a miniature fog in which the parents sometimes glimpsed miniature scenes. An orchard blooming and withering in the span of a heartbeat, a steeple collapsing into its own shadow, a child's shoe floating sole upward on a tide of ink. Obadiah, desperate, carried Deliverance to the river at twilight and lowered her into the current, hoping the water might shock appetite back into her. Instead, the river rose to meet her, wrapping her limbs in weed that had the texture of hair, and when he pulled her out, her skin was translucent enough to reveal the slow drift of organs, as though her body had become a tide chart of itself. On the first Sabbath of August, the minister returned, this time alone and without prayer. He carried instead a physician's scale, a gift from Boston, and asked permission to weigh the girls. Obadiah agreed, though he knew the act was sacrilege, measurement being the first step toward ownership. Mercy tipped the beam at 31 pounds, Deliverance at 34. The needle wavered as though reluctant to commit, and when the minister lifted his hand it continued to oscillate, writing a figure 8. Again and again, the symbol of infinity laid on its side, like a body refusing burial. On the night of the harvest moon, the parents woke to find the bed empty, save for themselves. The girls stood at the window, backs turned, faces lifted to the lunar disk, which appeared, through the warped glass, larger than any lamp of heaven should be, its surface pocked with shadows that shifted like schools of fish. Obadiah called their names, but the syllables left his mouth and fell straight to the floor, where they lay, twitching like moths pinned by invisible needles. Silence tried to cross the room, but her feet adhered to the boards, each step releasing a sound of suction, as though the house itself were drinking. The girls began to sway, their hair brushing the ceiling, though they stood on tiptoe no higher than before. With each sway the room contracted, the walls inching inward, the rafters lowering, until the parents knelt to avoid decapitation, and the air thickened to the consistency of porridge left to cool. Deliverance completed the rotation more slowly, her limbs articulating as though each joint had acquired an extra dimension, and when her gaze met her mother's, Silence felt her stomach invert, a sensation like a sack turning inside out, and she tasted on her tongue the iron of her own blood, though no wound had opened. The girls stepped forward in perfect synchrony, their bare feet leaving no impression on the boards, and placed their hands, ice-cold, weightless, on the parents' chests. Obadiah felt his heartbeat slow to match the cadence of their fasting, a rhythm so sparse that each beat seemed a door closing on a room he would never re-enter. Silence tried to speak the 23rd Psalm, but her lips would not part. Instead, the words formed inside her skull, letter by letter, carving themselves into the bone until she felt the scripture become a second skeleton, heavier than the first. Deliverance placed her mouth against her father's ear, not to speak, but to inhale. Obadiah felt the air drawn out of him in a long ribbon that carried with it every meal he had ever eaten, every word of comfort, every night he had lain beside his wife and felt the future expand like yeast in warm dough. When the girls stepped back, the parents crumpled, not asleep yet, not awake, suspended in a state that resembled the moment before, fainting when the world recedes but remains visible through a tunnel of granular darkness. They could still see, still hear, but could not move, their bodies reduced to ballast in a vessel whose sails were hunger. The girls left the house barefoot, crossing the yard without disturbing the frost. At the marsh edge they paused, silhouettes against the moon path that lay across the water like a road paved with bone. They walked single file, mercy behind, deliverance ahead, until the water reached their knees, their waists, their chests. At the moment, the tide covered their lips. They turned once more toward the house, raised their hands in a gesture that might have been blessing or farewell, and continued until the current closed over their heads without a ripple. Inside, the parents felt the pressure lift. Obadiah's heart lurched into a gallop. Silence's mouth opened with a gasp that tasted of rust, and they crawled to the window in time to see the moon dim as though a cloud had crossed it, though the sky remained clear. Below, on the tide flat, the water parted to reveal a path of stones leading eastward. On each stone stood a figure too small to be adult, too still to be living, their heads tilted at the angle of children listening for a summons beyond the range of human ears. Obadiah and Silence ran. No coat, no shoes. Across the yard, the frost cutting their feet like broken shells. But when they reached the marsh, the path had vanished. The water closed, and the only sound was the slow suck of mud releasing the memory of footprints. Overhead, the moon resumed its ordinary size, but its light now carried a texture like salt rubbed into a wound. They searched until dawn, calling until their voices cracked, but the river gave no answer except the slap of tide against alder roots. Eventually they returned to the house, where they found the table set for 4, the trenchers gleaming as though licked clean by invisible tongues, and in the center, the tin cup refilled with water that reflected not the ceiling, but the night sky of some other latitude. A vault crowded with constellations no ship had ever navigated. Obadiah drank, though he knew he should not. The water tasted of nothing, yet the absence was so complete it felt like a presence, and he understood that he had swallowed the space where his daughters had been, a vacancy that would now travel with him, expanding slowly until it displaced every other substance. Silence tried to write an account, but her quill snapped at the first letter. She took up the fragment and found the shaft hollow, the channel filled with a single hair the color of Mercy's, and she realized that every record would henceforth be written not with ink, but with absence, a palimpsest of what had refused to stay. News spread. Neighbors arrived with lanterns and ropes, but the marsh yielded only debris, a hair ribbon caught on a briar, a fingernail embedded in bark, a footprint so shallow it could have belonged to a child or to the wind that imitated one. The minister declared the event a judgment for secret sin. He preached a sermon on the sin of withholding sustenance from the least of these, though he never named the sinner, and the congregation filed out into the August sun feeling their stomachs shrink as though they had swallowed stones. Obadiah dismantled the bed, burned the quilts, and salted the earth beneath. The flames burned green, and in the heart of the fire the iron bedstead twisted into the shape of a cradle that rocked once before collapsing into embers. Silence packed the ledgers, the almanac, the Baxter, and carried them to the river. She floated them like paper boats, but instead of drifting they sank vertically, each page dissolving into a filament that resembled a child's hair waving in the current. They stayed on, though the house grew larger with emptiness. At night, they heard footsteps overhead, the slow drag of something being pulled across the floor. But when they climbed the ladder, they found only the imprint of 2 bodies on the boards, outlined in salt that sweated upward through the grain. Obadiah took to carving miniature barrels from apple wood, no taller than a thumb, and leaving them on the windowsill. By morning, each had filled with a drop of water that tasted of tide and tears, and he lined them along the mantel like a fleet waiting for a wind that blew from no quarter. Silence stopped speaking altogether. Her throat produced only a rasp like wind through reeds, and when she opened her mouth the odor of river bottom issued forth, as though she had become a vent for the marsh's exhalation. In October the crops failed. Corn stalks grew transparent, revealing within them the slow drift of sediment like hourglass sand, and pumpkins split to reveal cavities shaped like sleeping infants. The deacon who had found the girls breathing their last, though no one had told him the hour or the day, arrived to request the document Obadiah had signed in 1728. He claimed the probate court needed to settle debts, but when Obadiah handed him the folded paper, it burst into flame that did not burn the flesh yet, left the imprint of the words "Morbid Scripture" seared into the palm, a brand that would glow faintly whenever the deacon took communion, reminding him that he had handled the last will and testament of hunger itself. By winter, the parents had dwindled. Obadiah's ribs showed through his shirt like the staves of a ruined barrel, and Silence's eyes receded until they seemed to regard the world from the bottom of a well. They were found on the first Sunday of Advent, seated at the table, hands folded, the tin cup between them overturned for the first time. The water had spilled into the shape of 2 small footprints leading toward the door and disappearing at the threshold, the toes pointing outward as though the absent ones had finally come to collect what had been promised.